Here we go. So this evening I'm going to engage with and discuss the Transgender Day of Remembrance, because it is the Transgender Day of Remembrance. And following on from the memorial that's just taken place, I want this evening to be a memorial to trans lives lost and otherwise damaged over the year. And I think in the memorial that came through. People mentioned this. Mourn for lives lost and fight for lives. I can't remember exactly what it said, but fight for the living, I think it said. And at many TDoR events, the names of trans people who've lost their lives violently over the past year are intoned as participants are invited to pay their respects to the memory of often physically distant trans siblings. I'm sure we're all aware that almost all of the people whose tragic deaths have been commemorated at TDoR since 1999 have been designated as trans people, mostly trans women of colour. However, this, I believe, and we'll briefly discuss, represents a cultural simplification of the facts. I'm acutely aware that, as a white person, albeit trans, that my emplacement in this discussion is enshrouded in power relations. But the fact that most of these tragic deaths have occurred in places far away means that I and we are also separated by physical distance. However, I don't think that means we can't have a reflective and sensitive engagement with issues that I think that TDoR throws up. I think it's critically important that we hold on to an awareness of the violent deaths of trans people across the world, but I think we can usefully reflect on the meaning of violence for trans people and our wider communities. I think we can go further and locate our own responsibilities in fighting for justice for trans people and our non-binary and sex-gender non-conforming or variant siblings in our own communities, to give more focus and more meaning to the commemorations. So this evening I want to consider how we can usefully and sensitively engage with TDoR from a UK perspective, how we can reflect on the difficult experiences of trans and non-binary communities in the United Kingdom over the past year, and how such reflections can inform our activism and our politics in such a way that we don't erase the struggles of trans and non-binary people around the world, or simplify or totalise their and our ontologies and experiences. In plotting the pathway of this discussion, I want to take account of Sarah Lamball's proposition that it is not enough to simply honour the memory of the dead, we must transform the practices of the living. But this evening, if we reflect on our commemoration, we might gain insight into our own situations in the context of the difficult year that trans and non-binary communities and sex-gender non-conforming and variant individuals locally have just suffered. Aaron Azura has critiqued TDoR events, suggesting that they imprint a shocking transnational sensibility on proceedings. In discussing the symbolic burden placed on trans women of colour, many time immigrants, to represent themselves as victims of the most heinous crimes of transphobic violence, Azura notes that TDoR events often end in calls for nation-bound legislative recompense, which would not help most of the dead. Most of the dead wouldn't be helped, in part because many of them are, or were, undocumented migrants or sex workers, and thus not able to access legal protections. Indeed, often being the focus of anti-migrant or anti-sex work laws themselves. But this also raises the question, which I will go on to discuss, of the delimitations of the effectiveness of laws passed to protect trans people generally in any jurisdiction. To open up this discussion, we can note that, as Lamball suggests, and I will return to, by focusing on transphobia as the definitive cause of violence, we do not fully contextualise incidents of violence within their specific time and place, thus obscuring the ways in which hierarchies of race, class and sexuality situate and constitute such acts. In the process, transgender bodies are universalised along a singular identity plane of victimhood and rendered visible primarily through the violence that's acted upon them. TDoR has become a yearly point of focus for trans people and activists in general, who have joined the fight to highlight and resist violence against trans and sex-gender non-conforming people. The ultimate act of violence is, of course, the taking of a life, and this has been at the heart of what historically TDoR events have commemorated. I'd like to examine what we mean when we discuss violence against trans and sex-gender non-conforming people, though, and in the context of TDoR, how we can remark the acts arising from them. I also want to examine forms of violence that affect us in the UK and remark on who are mostly affected and why and how this should inform our politics and our practice. In the UK, we have a number of laws that are designed to offer recognition and protection to trans people, amongst others. In particular, the Gender Recognition Act and the Equality Act of 2010 explicitly recognise trans people, albeit under what has come to be known as the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. This peculiar construct in the Gender Recognition Act disadvantages many people in respect of legal recognition in the narrowness and transnormativity of its requirements to present as either relatively normatively female or male, to evidence this, and to commit to living in the acquired gender for the rest of one's life. The advantage of the protected characteristic is that it unwittingly offers itself up as a diagnostic tool for analysing who is considered to deserve recognition, and more importantly, who isn't. The Equality Act, as it were, inherited this construction as one of its 9 protected characteristics. The protections in the Act are more widely drawn and include protections for people who are perceived to possess the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, which, although legally untested, could be construed to include non-binary people, gender fluid or bi-gendered people. The protections in the Act apply to people in respect of employment, with some exceptions, and in relation to the provision of goods and services. This means that in theory, even the most vulnerable are protected, including people who are caught up in the criminal justice system. The protections that do exist, though, exist very unequally. They protect the people most who need protection least, and therefore protect the people who need the protections most the least. To give 2 examples, if you have a formally contracted, permanent, 37.5 hours a week job, and you are perceived to qualify under the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, then you get the whole protection that the law has to offer, and should, notwithstanding the exceptions referred to, receive full protection under the Equality Act and the right to change your birth certificate under the GRA. So if you're a permanently contracted teacher in a school, for example, then you should expect the law to protect you as you transition. This is happening in the UK, and it's good that it happens. Although, in the case of the tragic suicide of Lucy Meadows, the protection of the law was undercut by a profound lack of cultural protection, for which no one was ever held accountable. If you're a supply teacher, however, and, as happened to one of my respondents, previously plentiful work dries up after you declare your intention to transition, then the protection the law should offer evaporates. You have to prove that your transition is the reason, and unless an individual in the supply chain, an agency worker or someone in a school is remarkably indiscreet, then that simply won't be possible. And the same is true for any of what Guy Standing terms the precariat, people on 0-hour contracts or fixed-term renewable contracts, for example. And these people are not the most marginalised. They're in regular work and therefore, although arguably amongst the most vulnerable, not the most vulnerable. The protections also apply to populations of what might be termed the most vulnerable. That is, people who are enmeshed within the criminal justice system. Trans people in the criminal justice system are in theory protected by an instrument known as a prison service instruction. The one concerning trans people is called the Care and Management of Transgender Offenders, and this covers all people on remand, in prison, on probation or released on licence. In theory, it gives all trans people the same rights of recognition and access to treatment as the general population. In fact, the Bent Bars Project, which I just discussed, reports that trans people regularly have difficulty getting the treatments they're entitled to, despite the existence of these regulations which are supposed to guarantee their rights. There are a number of reasons given for this, given by the people in prison who communicate with us, amongst which are disbelief, apparent phobia, imposition of unrealistic and or normative requirements, and invidiously security. Trans women in men's prisons are regularly denied provision of their basic rights, such as being referred to by the correct name and gender, and being given access to appropriate clothing, cosmetics, toiletries, and where required, hair and breast prosthetics on the grounds of security. But the cases of trans women that excite the most contestation are those to do with being placed in women's prisons, whether they're placed there on conviction or transferred from men's prisons. Suffice it to say here that the evidence, perhaps unsurprisingly, suggests that the most legible or normative expressions of transness are those taken most seriously, and those more challenging from a hetero or possibly transnormative position are those least likely to receive the support they're legally entitled to. And this seems to be a common theme. The people that meet the expectations of what a trans woman should look like and behave like are those that will receive better treatment. If you're more challenging, it's far less likely. There's also a class of cases sometimes referred to as sex by deception cases, people convicted of gender fraud. These cases, stretching back to 2012, have involved claims by non-trans women that they've been deceived by people, sometimes with categorical male identities, sometimes more fluid or liminal identities, who've presented or been convicted as having presented as male, deceptively on account of their being assigned female at birth, but not having explicitly declared their assignation. And these cases highlight that although formal recognition exists for trans people to claim their preferred legal status, as long as their preference sits conveniently within the sex-gender binary, cultural blindness confers on trans, and in these cases clearly less legible and more liminal sex-gender expressions, a lack of recognition that has resulted in some quite lengthy convictions and some quite appalling sentencing remarks. These two pieces of legislation, then, are flawed and offer partial and inadequate recognition and support to trans people, and arguably none at all to non-binary and otherwise sex-gender non-conforming and variant people. They're exemplary pieces of neoliberal legislation which privilege what I have termed empty diversity, a depoliticised, instrumental and commodified recognition of difference. Thus, only the most normative expressions of diversity are recognised, and others continue to be marginalised and or expressly discriminated against. The construction of these laws and their corresponding restrictions and lacunae was incubated in the crucible of heteronormativity, cissexism and neoliberalism. Their enforcement, while they are enforced, and there have been surprisingly few trans-related cases held in the 8 years since the Equality Act was passed, relies on the cultural brutality inherent in the criminal justice system, from unfair sentences to highly inappropriate sentencing remarks, and the violence that incarceration visits on people generally, but trans and sex-gender non-conforming people in particular and specific ways, what Alex Sharp refers to as ontological violence. My discussion here underlines that even where we have laws designed to offer recognition and protection to trans, non-binary and sex-gender non-conforming and variant people, they fail. And sometimes they fail violently and catastrophically. As I'm sure everyone here will know, the government has recently been holding a consultation on revising the Gender Recognition Act with a view to bringing in some form of self-declaration for trans people. This would mean that in order to change our legally defined sex, to get a new birth certificate, trans people would only have to make a formal declaration of their intention to make the change, most likely from one binary marker to another, and to do so for the rest of their lives. The limitations in that are clear, but let's pass over those for now. What I'm interested in is discussing the backlash that these moderate proposals have provoked. Groups such as Women's Place and Fair Play for Women, set up to oppose any reform of the Gender Recognition Act, have campaigned against any changes that would involve self-ID and mobilised very successfully not only the small residual hardcore of feminist voices who are, and it's not difficult to suppose, will always retain what the human rights lawyer Michelle Brewer suggests is an ideological opposition to trans people's, and specifically trans women's, existence. The ultimate measure of their success, however, depends on the extent to which they can appeal to the common sense arguments which might be persuasive to people who haven't got experience or had any knowing and meaningful contact with trans and non-binary people in our lives. So they've plugged away at the ideas that science proves there are only two immutable sexes, that trans men are deluded dupes of the patriarchy, and their existence is a cause of butch erasure in lesbian communities, and a discourse in which trans women are reduced to the potential they are deemed to possess as violent predators, rather than taking account of the cultural, psychological and physical violence visited on us on a daily basis. And this is where we've been for the past year. Regular attacks against trans people across mainstream media have been vitriolic and dishonest. Social media platforms have intensified the waves of anti-trans propaganda. The dishonest, the uninformed, and the barefaced prejudice of many of the contributions has infected mainstream discussion and understanding of trans issues. Most recently, the thread on Mumsnet about people's horror that money was to be donated to Mermaids, a charity that supports young trans people and their families by children in need, was both revealing and backed up by a dishonest report, already in the public domain for over a year, by The Times story about a boy being forced to live as a girl. The Times, amongst all mainstream media in particular, has consistently provided a particularly virulent anti-trans stance over the past year. While this might not seem so surprising from a title in the Murdoch stable, The Guardian, who promised trans activists they would do better after the Julie Burchill debacle in 2013, when she described trans women and our allies as a bunch of dicks in chicks' clothing, a gaggle of transsexuals, the very vociferous transsexual lobby and their grim groupies, the trans lobby, screaming memes, the trannies, adding, they're lucky I'm not calling them she-males or shims, all printed in The Guardian, who promised they would never allow this again, but they've reneged, and they've printed content so bad that it prompted contributors in the United States to write and complain about the transphobic thrust of the stories, contextualised by their descriptions of worsening conditions for trans people in the States under a transphobic administration. There are so many more examples of this anti-trans wave of activism. We're fighting battles we thought we'd won years ago. The £45,000 advert against the GRA proposals in the Metro. The backlash against the Girl Guides trans inclusivity. The re-emergence of the discredited theory of autogynephilia. The hijacking of the London LGBTQ Pride March by a small group of transphobic lesbians. The claims of silencing by transphobic journalists and senior academics whose views appear only too regularly across mainstream British media. They're running with right-wing, sometimes evangelical and Trump-supporting wolves. The demonising of trans-supportive feminist groups such as Sisters Uncut, renaming them Misters Uncut. Gender Trender, Transgender Trend, and the myth of rapid onset gender dysphoria, doxing, and so the list goes on. And of course, all of this is effective. In 2017, the 2017 Stonewall School Report uncovered shocking statistics about the treatment of transgender pupils in school. With 51% of trans pupils being bullied, 1 in 10 receiving violent threats, 84% of trans kids self-harming, and 45% attempting suicide. These statistics reveal both the violence and the effects of the violence that trans, non-binary and sex-gender non-conforming young people suffer. The Stonewall Health Report for all ages of trans people reflects this. 21% of trans employees have been physically attacked by a colleague or customer in the past year. 51% of trans people have hidden their identity at work for fear of discrimination. And again, highlighting the plight of the most vulnerable, 25% of trans people have experienced homelessness. The list again goes on. Pink News reports anti-transgender hate crime reports up by 1/3 in 1 year, in the last year. When talking to engaged, intelligent and fully supportive friends who are very much in contact with LGBTQ communities, I've had to push back the idea that what we have experienced over the past year is exceptional. It has been very difficult, and most of the people I know have been affected to some degree. But my point here is that it's only a question of degree. These anti-trans voices, these violent discourses, have been around a long time. They present an unreconstructed echo of Janice Raymond's profoundly anti-trans 1979 essay, The Transsexual Empire. All that has happened is, with the proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act, anti-trans groups have been given a focus to dishonestly campaign against trans people using all the usual non-evidence-based transphobic cliches, dressed up as concern that women's spaces will be invaded by the fanciful, predatory trans woman, and to reference the word increasingly being used and lifted straight out of the lexicon of anti-gay propaganda from the 1970s and 80s, paedophiles. But all of these attacks are explicitly visited on trans people as a class, and on the transsexual menace that is supposed to lie behind every trans, in particular transfeminine, body. They make no distinction between the differences in our lives, in us as distinct and individual people, in the nuances or glaring dissimilarities, in our situations. And this is what I'm suggesting we hold in our minds when we commemorate our lost siblings every year. We know that transphobia continues to exist. We know that it's effective and harmful. We know that, apart from causing death, that there are many other impacts on our well-being. Trans people's mental health is generally poorer than that of non-trans people who have similar socio-economic advantages or disadvantages. We know trans people's access to healthcare, both trans-related and otherwise, suffers from underfunding and the lack of knowledge or the anti-trans bias of health professionals. We've just heard the statistic about trans homelessness. All of these traits are overrepresented in the populations of the criminal justice system, and we believe that trans people are over-criminalised as a population. These are the sources of anti-trans violence we should be concerned with. We also know that transness is a construct, and mainstream discourses about transness in the UK are refracted through a white Western lens. So while we might talk about non-binary erasure, we should also be aware of sex-gender non-conforming or variant people from all cultures whose senses of selves might fall outside of what we can describe as the Western sex change model. We shouldn't totalise trans experiences. We should recognise and celebrate sex-gender difference. But we should also note that privilege exists within trans communities, both locally and across borders. My transition, preferably difficult as it seemed, was at least possible. I have access to spaces such as these to discuss my views. I haven't lost my family or my friends. I have continued to be employed or been funded to study. But that privilege exists shouldn't obscure the ontological violence referred to above that erases the validity of non-binary and sex-gender non-conforming lives and bodies, and privileges transnormativity over less legible iterations or expressions of sex-gender. Neither should it obscure the intersectional disadvantage that disempower trans, non-binary and sex-gender non-conforming and variant people in terms of poverty, disability, ethnicity, sex, and where they live, even within the UK. And this perspective, I argue, should inform our political understanding and praxis. Trans activists have focused on legal routes to establishing and expanding trans rights. This focus from a narrow trans perspective, a liberal trans perspective, is open to critique though. Nat Raha, writing from a radical transfeminist perspective, notes that the neoliberal states in which these demands for equality are made reproduce socio-economic divisions along intersecting lines of race and class, gender sexuality, disability, nationality and immigration status. Without challenging the existing inequality of society, trans activism modelled on successful liberal lesbian and gay rights initiatives, such as the work undertaken by the Human Rights Campaign in the US and Stonewall UK, advocates for social inclusion that occurs with and through the disenfranchisement of the poor. She goes on to wonder, what are the implications of pursuing trans rights under these bitter, disenfranchising conditions? And this is where I want to focus my discussion. I implore you to use the occasion of TDoR as a commemoration for those who have lost their lives over the past year, but not only for that. To also use the occasion to recognise the ongoing daily cycle of erasure, discrimination and oppression, the actual violence that affects trans, non-binary and sex-gender non-conforming and variant people in the UK today. To recognise that the extraordinary outpouring of anti-trans discussion over the past year is both violent in itself and is not extraordinary. It's a more overt manifestation of the quotidian transphobia, cissexism and discrimination that we experience in our everyday lives, but only as a local condition within the wider conditions that disadvantage trans people and non-trans people profoundly. And in the recognition of this lies the base of a radical transfeminism that locates political activity both in recognising that trans issues need to be foregrounded in activist discussions, but contextualised in a discussion of broader material conditions and a more encompassing critical analysis of why people suffer disadvantage and violence. I want to finish by returning to the full quote that I partially referenced above by Lamble. While also recognising that the anti-trans push has encouraged a supportive wave of trans-positive feminism, that many workplaces, places of education and social spaces have continued to develop trans-positive policies and practices, it is still critically important that we recognise the violence and damage inflicted on trans, non-binary and sex-gender non-conforming and variant people and communities in a wider context. And the quote, our task then is to push these further, not only with respect to TDoR, but also in the many ways we recount and confront violence. None of us are innocent. We must envision practices of remembrance that situate our own positions within structures of power that authorise violence in the first place. Our task is to move from sympathy to responsibility, from complicity to reflexivity, from witnessing to action. It's not enough to simply honour the memory of the dead. We must transform the practices of the living.